When the screaming started in the lower tunnels of the San Juan Mining Company's number 3 shaft, Foreman Daniel Crawford knew immediately that something was wrong. Not the usual wrong of a cave-in or gas pocket or equipment failure. This was different. The screams carried a quality he'd never heard in 15 years of mining. Not pain, not fear of being trapped. This was primal terror. The sound of men confronting something their minds couldn't process. Crawford grabbed his lantern and ran toward the sound, his boots splashing through the shallow water that perpetually seeped through the Colorado mountain rock. Behind him, 3 other miners followed, their own lamps bobbing in the darkness like desperate fireflies. The screaming grew louder as they descended, echoing off the stone walls in a way that made it impossible to determine how many men were in distress. 2, 5, a dozen. Then the screaming stopped, cut off mid-cry, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse. Crawford rounded the corner into the newest section of tunnel, the expansion they'd been carving into the mountain for the past 3 weeks. What he saw in the lamplight made him freeze. 4 miners were running toward him, their faces pale and streaked with something dark, blood or mud or both. Behind them, the tunnel stretched into absolute blackness, the kind of darkness that swallowed light, the kind that felt alive. "What happened?" Crawford demanded. "Where's Peterson? Where's McKay?" Thomas Brennan, the lead blaster, grabbed Crawford's coat with shaking hands. His eyes were wild, unfocused. "They took them. God help us, Daniel. They took them into the deep caves. We have to seal it now, before they come back." "Who took them?" Crawford asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer couldn't make sense. Brennan's voice dropped to a whisper, as if saying it too loud would summon them back. "Things, people, I don't know, they weren't right. Their eyes, their skin, the way they moved. Jesus Christ, Daniel, we opened something we shouldn't have. There's something living in the deep caves, and it doesn't want us here." That was October 14th, 1908. By October 21st, 3 men would be dead. 5 more would be injured, and the San Juan Mining Company would seal number 3 shaft permanently, pouring concrete into the entrance and posting guards to ensure no one ever opened it again. The official report stated the tunnel was closed due to structural instability and toxic gas deposits. But the men who were there, the ones who survived, knew the truth. They'd broken through into a cave system that stretched deep into the Rocky Mountains, a system that had been hidden from sunlight for thousands, perhaps millions of years, a system that was inhabited. And whatever lived in those caves didn't appreciate visitors. To understand how experienced Colorado miners came to believe they'd been attacked by reptilian humanoids in the darkness beneath the Rockies, we need to go back 3 months. Back to July 1908, when the San Juan Mining Company first purchased the mineral rights to a promising silver deposit high in the San Juan Mountains. Back to when this was just another mining operation, just another attempt to pull wealth from the Colorado stone. Back to before they knew what was waiting in the deep places of the earth. The San Juan Mining Company was a modest operation by Colorado standards, not one of the massive corporate ventures that employed hundreds and carved entire mountains hollow. This was a smaller outfit, family-owned, running on investor capital and the hope that the silver veins in the high Rockies still had wealth to yield. Daniel Crawford, the operations foreman, was 38 years old in the summer of 1908. He'd been mining since he was 16, starting as a mucker in the Leadville camps during the silver boom of the 1880s. He'd worked his way up through experience and competence, earning respect through his knowledge of rock formations, his ability to read a seam, and his obsessive focus on safety. In an industry where cave-ins and gas explosions killed dozens of men every year, Crawford's crews had one of the best safety records in Colorado. He was a practical man, methodical, not given to superstition or flights of fancy. When miners talked about Tommyknockers, the mythical creatures said to haunt deep mines and warn of cave-ins, Crawford would smile tolerantly and redirect the conversation to proper timber shoring techniques. His crew of 18 men were similarly experienced. These weren't desperate newcomers willing to take any risk for a paycheck. These were professional hard rock miners. Men who understood geology, explosives, and the 1,000 ways a mountain could kill you if you weren't careful. Thomas Brennan, the lead blast. Had been setting charges in Colorado mines for 12 years. He could calculate powder loads in his head, accounting for rock density and desired fracture patterns. He'd never had a premature detonation or a misfire that cost lives. James Peterson and Colin McKay were the primary drift miners, the men who worked the advancing face of the tunnel, drilling holes for Brennan's charges. Both were in their late 20s, strong, experienced, and cautious. The crew included timbermen, muckers to clear debris, ore sorters, and equipment specialists. All told, it was a solid team. The kind that could work efficiently in the dangerous conditions a mile inside a mountain, where the rock groaned under its own weight and the air grew thin and hot. The silver deposit they'd come to exploit sat at 8,200 feet elevation, high in the San Juan Range, about 15 miles northwest of the town of Silverton. The location was remote, but accessible by a rough wagon road that switchbacked up the mountain. They'd established a small camp near the mine entrance, a collection of timber structures housing the crew, equipment, and ore processing facilities. The geology looked promising. Core samples showed silver-bearing ore in concentrations that could turn a profit. The plan was straightforward. Drive a horizontal tunnel into the mountain following the vein, extract the ore, and process it on-site before hauling the concentrated silver down to Silverton for final refining and sale. Work began in early July. The first month proceeded exactly as expected. They advanced the tunnel steadily, pulling out decent ore, establishing proper ventilation shafts, installing support timbers according to best practices. By early August, they'd penetrated 400 feet into the mountain and were pulling out ore that exceeded initial estimates. Everything was going well, better than well. The investors were pleased. The crew was making good wages. Crawford was running a safe, profitable operation. Then on August 19th, they broke through. James Peterson was drilling blast holes at the tunnel face, working methodically, when his drill bit suddenly punched through into empty space. Air rushed out of the hole with enough force to scatter the rock dust around it. Peterson pulled back, surprised. "Crawford," he called. "Got something here. Cavity of some kind behind this wall." Crawford came forward, examining the hole. He put his hand near the opening and felt the air movement. Definitely a cavity. Could be a small pocket, could be something larger. In mining, unexpected cavities were common. Sometimes they were small voids in the rock formation. Sometimes they were old, abandoned animal dens. Very rarely, they connected to natural cave systems. "Widen it carefully," Crawford instructed. "Let's see what we've got." Peterson drilled several more holes in a circular pattern. Then Brennan set light charges to fracture the rock. When the smoke cleared and they'd mucked out the debris, they had an opening about 3 feet in diameter. Crawford held his lantern up to the hole and looked through. The light revealed something unexpected. Beyond the opening was a cave, not a small pocket, a cave. The lantern light couldn't find the far wall or ceiling, just darkness extending beyond the light's reach. "Well, that's interesting," Crawford said. He'd encountered natural caves intersecting mine tunnels before, but they were usually small. This looked more substantial. Over the next 2 days, they carefully enlarged the opening to about 6 feet across, enough for a man to walk through comfortably. Crawford and 3 others conducted a preliminary exploration of the cave beyond. What they found was remarkable. The cave was massive. The floor was relatively level, sloping gently downward. The ceiling was lost in darkness above, at least 40 feet up. The walls were natural limestone, carved by ancient water flow into smooth, flowing shapes. The cave extended in multiple directions, with several passages leading away into darkness. More importantly, the cave system appeared to intersect additional silver-bearing rock formations. There were visible ore deposits in several locations, glinting in the lantern light. Crawford reported the discovery to the company owners. This was a significant find. If the cave system contained accessible silver deposits, they could potentially expand operations without the expense and danger of drilling through solid rock. Natural caves provided ready-made access to multiple areas of the mountain's interior. The decision was made to expand exploration of the cave system. They would map the accessible areas, assess ore deposits, and determine whether the caves could be safely incorporated into mining operations. It should have been good news, a stroke of luck. Nature had done the excavation work for them. But from the moment they enlarged that opening and began working in the natural caves, things started to feel wrong. The first full exploration of the cave system began on August 25, 1908. Crawford organized a team of 6 men, himself, Thomas Brennan, James Peterson, Colin McKay, and 2 experienced miners named Robert Hayes and William Chen. They carried multiple lanterns, rope, surveying equipment, and enough supplies for a 6-hour exploration. The cave beyond the mine tunnel was stunning in its scale. The main chamber, which they designated Chamber 1, was roughly oval, approximately 200 feet long and 100 feet wide. The floor was covered in a fine silt, suggesting ancient water deposits. The air was cool and surprisingly fresh, indicating ventilation connections to the surface somewhere in the complex. 3 major passages led away from Chamber 1. They chose the largest, a corridor about 15 feet wide that sloped gently downward. The limestone walls were smooth, carved by millennia of water flow into organic, flowing shapes that looked almost deliberate, almost artistic. 50 yards down the corridor, they encountered the first strange feature. On the cave wall about chest height were marks, scratches in the stone. At first, Crawford thought they were natural striations in the rock, but looking closer, they appeared too regular, too deliberate. They ran in parallel groups of 3 or 4 lines, each about 6 inches long, repeated in patterns along the wall. Animal claw marks, Peterson suggested, holding his lantern close. Maybe, Crawford said, though he wasn't convinced. He'd seen bear claw marks on trees. These were similar but not quite right. The spacing was wrong. The depth was inconsistent. And what animal would make marks this far underground? They continued deeper. The passage branched multiple times. They marked their path carefully with chalk, establishing a trail they could follow back. Standard cave exploration procedure. 200 yards from the mine tunnel, the passage opened into another large chamber, even bigger than the first. This one was spectacular. Massive limestone columns stretched from floor to ceiling, formed over millions of years by mineral-laden water. Stalactites hung from above like stone icicles. The whole space had an otherworldly beauty, like a cathedral carved by nature. But it was what they found on the floor of this chamber that made them pause. Bones, lots of them. The bones were scattered across a section of the cave floor, partially buried in silt. Animal bones, mostly. William Chen, who had some medical training, examined them. Elk, he thought. Deer, possibly mountain lion. The bones were old, weathered but not fossilized. Decades old, maybe. Certainly not recent. Animals must fall into this cave system from surface openings, Crawford reasoned. Get trapped, can't find their way out. It made sense. Limestone caves often had multiple entrances, hidden sinkholes and cracks where animals could accidentally fall through. But Thomas Brennan noticed something that troubled him. Many of the bones weren't scattered naturally. They were arranged, not in any pattern he recognized, but definitely moved from where they'd fallen, grouped together, some stacked. Animals don't arrange bones, Brennan said quietly. Water flow could move them, Hayes offered. Floods in the spring, maybe. Crawford wanted to believe that, but looking at the bone arrangements, he wasn't entirely convinced. They spent another 2 hours exploring the cave system, mapping 6 major chambers and at least a dozen connecting passages. The caves were extensive, far larger than they'd initially thought. Some passages descended steeply, leading deeper into the mountain. Others climbed upward, potentially connecting to surface openings. In Chamber 4, they found more marks on the walls, more of the parallel scratches, and something else. Circular designs, carved or scraped into the soft limestone, spirals, concentric circles. They looked old, the edges weathered smooth. Cave art, McKay suggested. Indians, maybe, living in these caves long ago. It was possible. Native peoples had inhabited this region for thousands of years. Using caves for shelter for ceremonies was well documented, but Crawford had seen Indian rock art before, usually pictographs painted with mineral pigments. These markings were different, more primitive, more alien. By early afternoon, they completed a preliminary survey. The cave system was enormous, extending at least half a mile into the mountain in multiple directions, with passages leading both deeper and higher. Several areas showed promising mineral deposits. From a mining perspective, it was valuable real estate. But there was something about the caves that unsettled all of them, though none wanted to be the first to say it. The silence was wrong, not peaceful, expectant, like the darkness was waiting for something. The air was fresh, but it carried a faint smell. They couldn't quite identify. Organic, slightly musty, like something living. And twice during the exploration, they'd heard sounds. Distant, echoing from deep passages they hadn't yet explored. Sounds that might have been falling rock, or might have been something else, something moving. They returned to the mine tunnel and filed their report. The cave system was extensive and showed promise for expanded mining operations. But Crawford added a recommendation. Further exploration should proceed cautiously, with larger teams, and they should make noise as they worked. If there were animals using these caves, bears or mountain lions, they needed to avoid surprising them in the confined spaces. Over the next 2 weeks, they established a regular work presence in the caves. Teams would enter daily to survey new areas, assess ore deposits, and begin planning extraction operations. They enlarged the entrance for easier equipment access. They brought in better lighting. They treated it like any other mining operation. But the unease persisted, and small things kept happening that defied easy explanation. The incident started small, easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize. On August 28th, a team working in Chamber 3 found their surveying equipment moved. They'd left it carefully positioned the previous day. When they returned, the tripod had been shifted 6 feet to the left, undamaged, just relocated. Someone's playing pranks was the general consensus. Annoying but harmless. On September 2nd, William Chen's lunch pail disappeared from Chamber 2's entrance. He'd set it down, worked for 30 minutes, and when he returned, it was gone. They never found it. Rats, someone suggested, though no one had seen any rodents in the caves. On September 6th, the first genuinely disturbing incident occurred. James Peterson was working alone in a side passage off Chamber 4 when he heard breathing, not his own, someone else's, close, just behind him. Peterson spun around, his lantern swinging. The passage was empty, but he could still hear it, breathing, slow, steady, coming from deeper in the passage, beyond where his light reached. "Hello," Peterson called out. "Someone there." The breathing stopped, silence. He quickly gathered his tools and returned to the main chamber. He reported what he'd heard. The others listened, and several admitted they'd felt watched at various times, like there were eyes in the darkness just beyond the lamplight. Crawford organized a thorough search. They found nothing, no evidence anyone had been there. Echo effects, Crawford explained. Sound travels strangely in caves. Peterson wanted to believe that, but he'd heard breathing. Not hammering, not voices, breathing. The incidents escalated. On September 10th, Robert Hayes saw movement in Chamber 5, something darting between limestone columns. Pale, fast, gone before he could focus on it. On September 14th, 3 different miners reported the same thing, the feeling of being touched. Light touches on their shoulders, their backs, when no one was near them, like fingers brushing past in the darkness. Crawford was beginning to worry, not because he believed in ghosts, but because fear was contagious. If the crew started believing the caves were haunted, they'd refuse to work. He called a meeting, explained that caves were disorienting environments, That human senses could misinterpret stimuli in absolute darkness. That sounds echoed strangely. That shadows created illusions. It was reasonable, logical, but privately many of them were becoming convinced that something was wrong with these caves, that they weren't alone down there. On September 19th, they made a discovery that changed everything. A team found a chamber they hadn't mapped before, roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, and it was clearly inhabited. Not recently, not by humans, but inhabited nonetheless. The floor was covered in what could only be described as nests, circular depressions in the silt lined with decomposed material, dozens of them, all roughly the same size, all arranged in a pattern around the chamber's perimeter. In the center was a pile of objects, bones, metal pieces, a rusted knife blade, fragments of rotted cloth, stones arranged in patterns, and dozens of shells from freshwater mussels, each one carefully cleaned, the insides polished smooth. "What the hell is this?" Colin McKay breathed. William Chen knelt beside one of the nests. The depression was about 4 feet in diameter, the right size for a human to curl up in, or something human-sized. "People lived here," Chen said slowly, "or something did." They searched the chamber thoroughly, found more arranged objects, more nest structures, and on the walls more markings, the same parallel scratches, the same spiral designs, but also handprints, or what looked like handprints. The prints were humanoid in shape, 5 digits, but wrong in the proportions. The fingers too long, the palm too narrow, and the texture suggested skin that wasn't quite right, rougher, scaled. Thomas Brennan examined the prints closely. "These aren't human," he said quietly. "Look at the finger length compared to the palm, and the texture, like a lizard." They documented everything, then returned to the surface and reported to Crawford. This was evidence of habitation. Something had lived here, made nests, collected objects, marked territory. The question was, when, and more importantly, were they still here? Crawford made a decision. They would bring in an expert, someone who understood cave ecosystems and could examine the evidence with scientific objectivity. Dr. Elizabeth Marsh arrived on September 25th. She was one of the few female naturalists working in the American West, specializing in cave biology and paleontology. She'd explored cave systems throughout Colorado and had published several papers on cave-dwelling species. Crawford gave her a full briefing and guided her into the caves. Dr. Marsh spent 2 days exploring the system, examining the nest chamber, studying the markings, analyzing the bone collections. Her conclusions were delivered on September 27th in Crawford's office. The news wasn't reassuring. Dr. Elizabeth Marsh sat across from Daniel Crawford, her notebook open, her expression troubled. 2 days examining evidence that challenged everything she understood. "Mr. Crawford, I deal in observable facts. What I'm about to tell you is based on evidence, but the implications are unusual." Crawford leaned forward. "Just tell me straight, Doctor." The nest chamber shows habitation by something bipedal, roughly human-sized, exhibiting tool use and complex behavior. The bone arrangements suggest ritualistic behavior. The handprints are anatomically similar to human hands, but with significant variations. How old? The nest materials aren't ancient. Decades, perhaps a century at most. The handprints could be anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand years old. Crawford absorbed this. Cave-dwelling people. Possibly, but the handprint proportions are wrong for Homo sapiens. The finger length relative to palm size suggests subspecies variation we haven't encountered. She opened her notebook to sketches. "I found shed skin fragments in deeper passages. Thin, translucent material. Preliminary examination suggests keratin structure similar to reptilian scales, not mammalian skin." The room went quiet. "You're saying there's lizard people in my caves," Crawford said flatly. "I'm saying there's evidence of a cave-dwelling species with characteristics we don't understand. Something intelligent lived here recently. something with physical characteristics differing from known human populations. Are they still here? I believe so. I found recent activity in the deepest passages, disturbed silt, fresh scratch marks, and I heard movement from areas too deep for me to explore alone. What do you recommend? Scientifically, cease operations immediately. This could be one of the most significant biological discoveries in history. Marsh's expression darkened. Practically, if this species has survived hidden for generations, it's because they avoid contact. You've invaded their territory. If they feel threatened, they may defend themselves. You think they're dangerous. I think any intelligent species protecting its territory is potentially dangerous. That uncertainty makes them very dangerous. Crawford sat alone after she left, weighing options. He couldn't shut down based on speculation. His decision: continue mining with modifications, work in larger groups, stay in outer chambers, avoid deep passages, keep weapons handy. A calculated risk. Keep operating while minimizing confrontation. For 2 weeks it worked. The crew stayed shallow. Strange incidents decreased. Just steady, careful work. Crawford thought they'd reached an understanding. Creatures stayed deep. Miners stayed shallow. Peaceful coexistence. He was wrong. October 12th, Colin McKay found fresh claw marks near Chamber 1. Deep cuts in solid limestone, positioned directly beside the chalk mark, indicating the path back, like something had deliberately marked the human trail. October 13th, Chamber 2's temperature dropped dramatically, cold enough to see breath. No geological explanation. October 14th, James Peterson and Colin McKay went into the deeper passages, against Crawford's direct orders, against common sense, looking for a silver vein Peterson swore he'd seen. They went deep into the territory of whatever lived in darkness. And whatever lived, their decided coexistence was over. When the screaming started, Daniel Crawford knew his compromise had failed. The creatures had been patient, had tolerated human presence near the entrance, but Peterson and McKay had crossed an invisible line. Crawford grabbed his lantern and ran toward the screams. No. Wing, he was already too late. Something had happened in the deep caves. Something terrible. And nothing would ever be the same. Daniel Crawford's lantern cut through the main tunnel as he ran, breath ragged. 3 miners followed, lights flickering wildly. The screaming had stopped, but the memory of it chased him. They reached Chamber 1 just as Thomas Brennan and 2 others stumbled out of the deeper passage. Brennan's face was chalk white, eyes wide. Blood streaked his forehead. William Chen supported Robert Hayes, whose left arm hung at a sick angle. "Where are Peterson and McKay?" Crawford demanded. Brennan shook his head. "Gone. Jesus, Daniel, we have to get out." A sound rose from the depth. Not screaming, not human, clicking, hissing, several sources, getting closer. "Move," Crawford barked. "Back to the mine tunnel." They ran. Hayes faltered, Chen struggling to keep him up until Crawford helped. Behind them, the clicking grew louder, now joined by the scrape of claws and fast-moving bodies. They burst into the mine tunnel and kept running. Crawford counted 7 men. They'd gone in with 9. Peterson and McKay were still below, if anything of them remained. Only once they climbed the ladder to the surface and stood trembling in the Colorado sunlight did Crawford allow himself to think. Hayes was rushed to the medical tent. Brennan sat shaking on a crate. Chen paced, glancing constantly at the mine entrance. After 10 minutes, Crawford crouched beside Brennan. "Tell me from the beginning." Brennan explained. They'd been working in Chamber 3 when Peterson insisted on checking a deeper silver vein, despite orders to stay shallow. Brennan reluctantly went with him, bringing Hayes and Chen. They followed old chalk marks past Chamber 5 into areas untouched for a week. The air grew colder. The musty, organic smell returned, stronger now, reptile house strong. In a narrow passage, they found a body. Not one of theirs, something else. 4 feet long, Humanoid but wrong. Pale, translucent, faintly green skin, scaled. An elongated head, large empty eye sockets adapted for darkness, long fingers ending in small claws. It had been dead for weeks. "What the hell is that?" McKay whispered. No one knew. A reptile-human hybrid that shouldn't exist. Peterson suggested bringing it to the surface as proof, but when Hayes reached for it, the clicking began, from deeper ahead, insect-like but deliberate. Then eyes appeared, dozens glowing pale green. The creatures stepped into the lantern light, upright, tailed, scaled, ranging from 4 to 6 feet tall, carrying primitive tools, stone blades, sharpened bones, even a crude spear. "How many?" Crawford asked. "At least 20, Brennan said. The creatures stopped 20 feet away, watching, clicking to each other. The largest stepped forward, vocalizing a deep, almost language sound, intelligent, studying them. For a moment, Brennan thought they might be allowed to leave. Then McKay panicked, fired. The shot ricocheted off the wall. Instantly, the creatures shrieked and charged, fast and coordinated. McKay got off one more shot before they reached him. Then he was dragged down, screaming. Peterson tried to go back for him, breaking free of Brennan's grip. Brennan never saw him again. He was already fleeing with Chen and Hayes. Hayes fell and broke his arm, but they pulled him up and ran. The creatures chased them through 2 chambers, stopping at the edge of the upper caves, as if obeying a boundary. When Brennan finished, Crawford processed the loss of 2 men and the discovery of a territorial, intelligent species living underground. "Did anyone else see them?" Crawford asked. Chen and Hayes confirmed every detail. Crawford stood. "We seal the caves, today, permanently." "What about Peterson and McKay?" Brennan said. "They might still be alive." "They're dead," Crawford said. "We're not losing more men." For 6 hours, the crew poured concrete into the opening, mixing it with rock until the passage was entirely entombed. By nightfall, the caves were sealed, but Crawford knew the real ordeal was only beginning. Now they had to explain what happened, and no one would believe them. The concrete seal held through the night of October 14th, but no one slept easy. Guards were posted at the mine entrance with lanterns and rifles, watching for any sign that the creatures had found another way out. None appeared. The night passed in tense silence. At dawn on October 15th, Daniel Crawford telegraphed the San Juan Mining Company owners in Denver. His message was brief and carefully worded. Encountered extreme safety hazard in cave system. 2 men lost. Sealed access. Request immediate company representative on site. The response came within hours. Representative arriving October 17th. Provide detailed written report. Operations suspended pending investigation. Crawford spent that day and the next documenting everything. He interviewed each witness separa, recording their accounts. He sketched maps of the cave system from memory. He collected Dr. Marsh's notes and samples, and he wrote his own detailed report of what had happened, knowing even as he did how insane it would sound. On October 17th, Harrison Welch arrived from Denver. Welch was the company's operations manager, a businessman with no mining experience but complete authority over the operation's continuation or closure. He was skeptical from the moment he stepped off the wagon. Crawford presented the evidence, the witness statements, Dr. Marsh's scientific analysis, the sealed entrance, the injured Hayes with his broken arm, the missing Peterson and McKay. Welch listened impassively. When Crawford finished, the manager's response was blunt. "You're telling me you lost 2 men and sealed a potentially profitable cave system because you saw lizard people. I'm telling you we encountered an unknown species exhibiting territorial aggression, and I made the decision to prevent further casualties," Crawford corrected. "An unknown species," Welch repeated. "Bipedal reptiles, living in caves, using tools and weapons. You understand how that sounds?" "I understand perfectly," Crawford said. Which is why I have multiple witness statements, all corroborating the same details. These are experienced miners, Mr. Welch, rational men. They know what they saw. Welch reviewed the statements again, frowned. Dr. Marsh's analysis mentions possible cave-adapted hominid species. That's not lizard people. That's more like primitive humans, deformed maybe from generations of inbreeding and cave dwelling. The witnesses describe scales, Crawford said, tails, reptilian features. In poor light, underground, in a state of panic, Welch countered. Human perception is unreliable under stress. They saw pale, thin people living in caves and their minds filled in the gaps with monster details. It was a rational explanation. Crawford almost wished he could believe it, but he'd seen Brennan's face, heard the terror in his voice. These weren't men misidentifying deformed humans. They'd seen something genuinely other. Welch made his decision. The cave system remains sealed. We don't have the resources or expertise to deal with whatever's down there, if anything. The mining operation will continue in the original tunnel only, avoiding the caves entirely. Peterson and McKay will be listed as killed in a cave-in. Their families will receive standard death benefits, and no one discusses the specific nature of what happened. Is that clear? You want us to lie, Crawford said. I want you to use discretion, Welch corrected. The truth, whatever it is, helps no one. It won't bring those men back. It'll just create panic and potentially destroy this company. We tell a version of events that's simplified, understandable. Crawford understood. The company couldn't afford the scandal of reporting cryptid encounters, couldn't risk the investigation and scrutiny that would follow claims of reptilian cave dwellers. Better to bury the truth along with the cave entrance. Over Crawford's objections, Welch implemented the cover story. Official reports stated that Peterson and McKay had died in a cave-in while exploring an unstable natural cave system intersecting the mine tunnel. The cave had been permanently sealed to prevent future incidents. An unfortunate accident, tragic but not unusual in the mining industry. The crew was given a choice: accept the official story and continue working, or leave with severance pay and a non-disclosure agreement. Most chose to leave. Brennan, Chen, Hayes, and 4 others took their pay and departed within a week, scattered to other mining operations across Colorado, carrying with them the truth they were forbidden to speak. Only 3 members of the original crew stayed. Daniel Crawford, who felt responsible for seeing the operation through, and 2 younger miners who hadn't been present during the attack and didn't fully believe the stories anyway. The San Juan Mining Company continued operations through the winter of 1908, working the original mine tunnel carefully, never approaching the sealed cave entrance. They extracted modest amounts of silver, made enough to keep investors satisfied, and tried to forget what was entombed behind tons of concrete just a few hundred feet away. But forgetting was impossible, because the creatures, whatever they were, hadn't forgotten. Throughout the winter, workers reported sounds, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind the sealed wall, scratching, clicking, sometimes what sounded like deliberate tapping, as if something was testing the concrete, looking for weaknesses. Crawford reinforced the seal twice, adding more concrete, more rock fill. The sounds continued, not constant, but regular enough to remind everyone that something was still down there, still aware of the humans above, still waiting. The San Juan Mining Company No. 3 shaft operated for 18 more months after the cave sealing, extracting $40,000 worth of silver ore, modest returns, nothing approaching hoped-for profits. The mine never felt right after October 1908. Workers complained of unease, equipment malfunctioned, accidents occurred with unusual regularity, as if the mine itself had become unlucky. In April 1910, the company closed No. 3 permanently. The official reason cited declining ore quality. The real reason, discussed only in private board meetings, was that they couldn't keep crews working in a mine where men heard things in the walls and refused to work alone. The mine entrance was sealed, concrete, timber barricades, warning signs. By 1915, little evidence remained that mining had ever occurred there. The men who'd witnessed the creatures scattered across the western United States. Most never spoke publicly. The non-disclosure agreements and the certain knowledge that no one would believe them kept them silent. But some couldn't stay silent forever. In private moments, fragments of the truth emerged. Not the full story, just pieces, enough to create whispers. Thomas Brennan told a fellow miner about pale things living in deep caves in Colorado. The story spread, embellished with each retelling. William Chen wrote a professor describing an encounter with a previously unknown cave-dwelling species exhibiting both reptilian and humanoid characteristics. The professor dismissed it as frontier tall tales. Robert Hayes gave an interview in 1922 describing the sealed caves but refusing details, saying only, "Some things are better left buried, and some places belong to older things than us." The interview was published in a small regional paper and forgotten. Hayes died in 1924. Daniel Crawford worked in mining until 1918, when age forced his retirement. He settled in Silverton, 15 miles from the sealed shaft. He never returned to the site. In 1925, a geology student approached Crawford, asking about the cave system. Crawford's response was immediate. "The cave is sealed. It will remain sealed, and if you have any sense, you'll stop looking for it." When the student pressed, Crawford said something the student remembered for the rest of his life. "The mountains are older than we are, deeper than we can imagine, and in the deep places, things adapted to darkness in ways we never had to. We think we've catalogued everything, but we're wrong. There are older residents, ones who were here long before us and will be here long after. The smart thing is to leave them alone." The student reported this to his professors, who dismissed it as the ramblings of an old miner. No expedition was organized. Crawford died in 1931. Dr. Elizabeth Marsh attempted to publish her findings in 1912. She submitted a paper titled "Evidence of Unknown Cave-Adapted Species in the North American Rocky Mountains." The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted the lack of photographic evidence and reliance on witness testimony from unreliable frontier workers. Marsh never published on the subject again, but she kept her notes and her certainty that something extraordinary existed in those sealed caves. She died in 1938. Her research materials remain in storage, largely unexamined. The concrete held, the mountain kept its secrets. But occasionally, even now, hikers in the San Juan Range report strange phenomena. Sounds from cave openings, glimpses of pale figures, unusual trackways, humanoid but wrong in the proportions. These reports are dismissed as misidentifications, shadows, the human tendency to see patterns in random phenomena, and perhaps that's all they are. Or perhaps the caves hold exactly what those miners found in 1908, a species that adapted to the deep places, that learned to avoid the surface world and the dangerous humans that occasionally wandered into their territory. A species that's still there, still waiting in the darkness. We'll probably never know for certain, because the people who have seen them don't talk, and the people who talk haven't seen them. And the entrance to their world remains sealed, buried under concrete and stone and a century of silence. Exactly as it should be. The official story satisfied investors and government inspectors. 2 men killed in a cave-in, dangerous geological conditions, responsible decision to seal and abandon, case closed. But in mining communities, where truth was valued more than company politics, rumors circulated. Not the full story, most witnesses honored their non-disclosure agreements, but fragments, hints, enough to create a mythology. By 1912, miners throughout Colorado shared stories about the things in the San Juan caves. Details varied wildly. Some described albino cannibals. Others spoke of surviving prehistoric humans. A few mentioned reptilian features. The most persistent version described pale, scaled creatures that walked like men, but weren't human. creatures that defended their caves with intelligence and weapons, creatures sealed behind concrete to prevent further deaths. Most dismissed these as typical frontier mythology, but some miners took the stories seriously, particularly those who'd worked deep caves and had their own experiences with unexplained phenomena. In 1915, a miner named Joseph Blackwood was working a deep shaft in the Sangre de Cristo range. He reported finding a chamber similar to what Brennan had described: nest-like depressions, arranged bones, markings on walls. The foreman's response was immediate: seal the chamber, pour concrete, don't discuss what you found. When Blackwood asked why, the foreman said simply, "Because if the company thinks there's something down there, we're out of work. Better to seal it quietly and forget." This pattern repeated throughout the 1920s and 30s. Miners occasionally reported finding chambers with evidence of habitation, and in every case, the response was the same: seal it, don't report it, keep working. In 1923, journalist Catherine Mills was researching mining safety for the Denver Post. During interviews, she kept hearing references to the sealed chambers and the things we don't talk about. One dying foreman told her about the San Juan Incident. Mills investigated. She found the closure records. She noted the discrepancies. The shaft had been profitable when it closed. The official explanation didn't match geological data, and she found evidence of unusually large severance payments. She submitted her article to the Post. It was rejected. Too speculative. Without hard evidence or on-the-record testimonies, it was unpublishable. Mills published a fictionalized version in Weird Tales in 1924, titled The Pale Ones Beneath. The story described miners encountering reptilian humanoids in Colorado caves. It was popular with readers, but had no impact on mining policy. It was fiction. Nobody took it seriously. But miners read Weird Tales, and those who'd had their own experiences recognized elements of truth. The story became a way to obliquely reference real phenomena. "It's like that Weird Tales story," they'd say, and other miners would understand. By the 1930s, informal rules developed among deep cave miners. If you find chambers with signs of habitation, don't investigate further. If you hear movement in unexplored tunnels, don't follow it. If you find bones arranged in patterns, seal that section immediately. If you smell ammonia and something wrong, retreat. And if you see something pale moving in your lamplight, something that walks upright but isn't human, run. In 1941, with America entering World War II, mining operations expanded dramatically. Demand for metals skyrocketed. Miners worked deeper faster with less caution. That's when encounters increased. A copper mine in New Mexico broke through into a cave system in 1942. The first crew found a chamber that had been recently inhabited: food remnants, water storage, and human remains, recent enough that some tissue remained. Authorities investigated, couldn't identify the deceased, and filed it as unknown. The chamber was sealed. But the crew knew something was wrong. The remains had been deliberately placed, and the bones showed marks consistent with butchering. One crew member, Thomas Gray, couldn't let it go. After the war, he became a private investigator, and he noticed a pattern. Throughout the Southwest, there was a higher-than-average rate of unexplained disappearances near cave systems. Between 1900 and 1950, Gray identified over 200 disappearances that shared common factors: proximity to deep caves, experienced outdoorsmen who shouldn't have gotten lost, and no bodies recovered. Gray noticed clustering. Certain areas had significantly higher rates, and those areas corresponded to regions with the most persistent rumors of things in the caves. Gray attempted to publish his findings. No newspaper would touch it. The FBI investigated, found no evidence of foul play, and closed the case. Gray died in 1967, still convinced he'd uncovered something real. His files sat unexamined until 1993, when graduate student Rebecca Torres discovered them and noticed something Gray had missed. The disappearances had decreased sharply after 1950. The rate dropped by half. Why? Tours theorized that mining activity in remote areas had decreased. Without miners constantly pushing into new cave systems, encounters became rarer. When left alone, the creatures didn't hunt humans. The disappearances weren't random. They correlated with human intrusion. When humans entered the caves, some didn't come back. When humans stopped entering, the disappearances stopped. Tours published her thesis in 1994. It received minimal attention, but those familiar with the mining stories recognized the connection. By the 1990s, the generation who'd worked the deep caves was mostly gone, but the internet arrived. Forums where people could share experience. Anonymously. Users posted stories their grandfathers had told them. Miners' journals were digitized. Catherine Mill's story was republished online, and people began connecting dots scattered across a century. The San Juan Incident, similar encounters in the teens and 20s, the sealing of chambers, the wartime disappearances, the statistical correlations, fragmented folklore coalesced into a coherent pattern. And then, in 2007, something changed the conversation entirely. A caving expedition in southern Colorado explored a system sealed since the 1930s. In a chamber 800 feet below the surface, they found evidence of habitation, bone arrangements, wall markings, and modern materials. A water bottle dated 2003. A backpack containing identification for a man reported missing in 2001. Authorities recovered the materials, but they found no human remains, and forensic teams made a disturbing discovery. The missing man's belongings had been deliberately placed, arranged, and the bone patterns included human bones, recent ones. Cut marks suggested butchering. The case was classified as probable homicide, but no suspect was ever identified. The cave was sealed permanently. But photographs had already been uploaded to the internet. The images showed everything. And in one photograph, barely visible in the background, something else. A pale shape, humanoid, moving away from the camera's flash, blurred and indistinct. But those familiar with the historical accounts recognized it. The size, the posture. It looked exactly like what Brennan had described in 1908. The photograph went viral in cryptozoology communities. Experts analyzed it. Skeptics debunked it. Believers championed it. The debate raged for years. But to the people who'd seen similar things, the photograph wasn't ambiguous. It was confirmation. They'd been telling the truth, and no one had listened. By 2010, the collective body of evidence had created something unprecedented. Not proof, exactly, but a compelling case that something existed in the deep cave systems of the Southwest. Something that avoided contact when possible, but something that would defend its territory, hunt when necessary, and had been doing so for at least a century. Mainstream science still rejected the claims. Without a specimen, without definitive evidence, the existence of cave-dwelling humanoids remained unproven. But the people who knew, who'd seen, who'd survived encounters didn't need scientific validation. They knew what they'd experienced. They knew what lived in the darkness beneath the mountains. And they knew that when the San Juan No. 3 shaft was sealed in 1908, it wasn't to contain a cave-in. It was to contain something that humanity wasn't ready to acknowledge. Something that still lives in the deep places, still watches, still waits.